Welcome to today's session on the tipping point. In this lecture, we're going to explore the concept of how small actions or trends can create massive, rapid changes in society. Just like a line of dominoes tipping over from a single push, this concept is incredibly powerful because it can explain sudden shifts in trends, or even how crime rates fall or rise dramatically. Think about the image in front of you. What do you see? A line of dominoes, just waiting for the slightest push to send them all tumbling. That's what the tipping point is all about. Small changes that set off a chain reaction, leading to significant, often outcomes. We'll start by examining two key case studies. First, how Hush Puppies, a seemingly dead fashion brand, suddenly surged back into popularity in the mid-1990s. And second, how New York City's crime rate plummeted during the same period. Both of these phenomena followed the same small, almost unnoticed change that created a massive shift. The key here is to understand the nature of these shifts and how they are driven by contagious behaviors, small causes leading to big effects, and most importantly, how these changes happen all at once, what we call a tipping point. In this session, we'll break down the theory behind these changes, what drives them, and how this idea of the tipping point applies not only to fashion and crime, but also to how we see movements in technology, marketing, even in public health. So let's get started with the first case study, the Puppies. How did a brand that was on the verge of extinction suddenly explode back onto the scene? And what can we learn from that about trends and social behaviors? As we dive into the lecture, feel free to think of examples from your own life where you've seen sudden changes. Maybe in the popularity of a product, a meme, we socially interact online. This will help you understand how seemingly small moments can have a massive impact. All right, let's jump into the details of Hush Puppies and the first steps toward the tipping. Now let's dive deeper into our first case study, the revival of Hush Puppies. If you look at the timeline on this slide, you'll notice a remarkable journey that took place over just a couple of years. Back in 1994, Hush Puppies was on the brink of extinction. Sales had plummeted to around 30,000 a year, mostly in small-town family stores and backwoods outlets. The parent company, Wolverine, was actually considering phasing out the brand entirely. But here's where things get interesting. The story didn't end there. In fact, it was just the calm before the storm. Fast forward to late 1994 and early 2005. This is when the tipping point occurred. Two executives from Hush Puppies, Owen Baxter and Jeffrey Lewis, were attending a fashion shoot in New York City. During this event, they were informed by a stylist that Hush Puppies had somehow become hip in downtown Manhattan, resale shops in neighborhoods like the Village and Soho. Now, these shoes, which were almost forgotten, suddenly became a fashion statement in one of the most trend-setting places in the world. It's as if the fashion scene in New York picked up the shoes, brushed off the dust, and said, "Making these cool again." And this shift didn't happen through advertisements or aggressive marketing campaigns. No, it was purely word of mouth. The shoes spread in popularity from one person to the next, almost like a fashion virus. This is a perfect example of how contagious behaviors work, and it gets picked up by a small, influential group of people, and it just tips. By the fall of 1995, the fashion industry started to take notice. Prominent designers like John Bartlett and Anna Sui requested Hush Puppies for their collections. This is a critical moment. When fashion decides to use a product, it signals to the wider public that something is truly in vogue. In Los Angeles, another designer, Joel Fitzgerald, went as far as opening a Hush Puppies boutique, even before he had finished painting the store. That shows the momentum that was building. By 1996, sales skyrocketed from just 30,000 pairs to over 430,000 in 1995 alone. And the next year, sales quadrupled. Hush Puppies even won a fashion award at the Council of Fashion Designers dinner. What's incredible is that the company itself wasn't driving the trend. People, small groups of influencers and designers were This is a clear example of a tipping point in action. A tiny group of individuals triggered a massive change in the brand's trajectory. What started as a niche trend in one corner of Manhattan across the country. And the key takeaway here is that it didn't happen through traditional means. It was organic, viral, and driven by the behavior of a few influential trendsetters. This sets the stage for understanding the key elements of tipping points, small big effects, and contagious behaviors. Let's talk about the unexpected comeback of Hush Puppies. This is where things get fascinating, as the revival of the brand wasn't a result of intentional marketing or corporate strategy, but rather something much more organic. We start with the initial spark. As the slide mentions, the revival was just a handful of kids in places like the East Village and Soho in New York. These young people were not trendsetters in the conventional sense. They were wearing Hush Puppies precisely because no one else would. It's almost ironic, isn't it? They weren't trying to start a trend or promote the brand, making a personal, almost anti-fashion statement by wearing something out of style. Yet, unknowingly, they planted the seed for a major fashion revival. Next, we see fashion industry adoption. This is when the trend really began to pick up steam. Two well-known fashion designers, John Sui, noticed this underground trend and decided to incorporate Hush Puppies into their collections. The shoes themselves weren't even the main focus of their collections. They were more of an incidental touch. However, this is where the influence of fashion designers really comes into play. Big names in fashion add something to their runway shows. It sends a signal to the industry and the public. This is cool. Even though the shoes were just a small detail, they became a symbolic part of the designer's aesthetic, and people took notice. Finally, we have rapid spread, marketing push or promotion. Hush Puppies went from this small niche group of Manhattan hipsters to being a fashion staple in every mall across America within 2 short years. That's astonishing growth, especially when you consider the fact that the company itself didn't actively push. This was an entirely organic spread, a viral trend that grew purely through word of mouth and fashion industry buzz. It's like the shoes caught a spark and the flames spread incredibly quickly. This is a textbook example of how trends don't always need big campaigns or strategy. Sometimes all it takes is a small, seemingly insignificant group of people to start wearing or using a product, and that's enough to tip it into the mainstream. This concept applies beyond fashion. It's the same reason why some apps, songs, or even ideas suddenly become popular overnight. What makes this example so compelling is that no one could have predicted it. No one was trying to force this comeback. It happened naturally. And this is a key component of the tipping point. It's often those small, unpredictable moments that create the biggest changes. Up next, we'll explain principles apply to a completely different scenario, the dramatic drop in New York City's crime rate in the 1990s. Now let's shift our focus to another fascinating example of the tipping point in action, New York City's crime rate decline in the 1990s. Just like with the Hush Puppies comeback, this story is about a dramatic change that seemed to happen almost overnight, after years of high crime rates. Talk about the 1980s to the early 1990s. This period was marked by extreme crime levels in places like Brownsville and East New York, some of the city's most economically disadvantaged areas. The streets were dangerous, and it wasn't uncommon for residents to avoid night. The drug trade, especially the rise of crack cocaine, fueled much of the gang violence and robberies. In 1992, there were over 2,100 murders and more than 600,000 serious crimes in the city. It was a grim time for New York, and it seemed like things would only. However, between 1992 and 1997, something changed. Crime didn't just gradually decline, it tipped. Within just 5 years, the murder rate dropped by an incredible 64 3%, down to 770 murders, and total crimes fell almost by. This is the second part of the slide, the tipping point. What's so intriguing is that the shift was rapid and dramatic, much like the way hush puppies suddenly became a fashion staple. But in this case, it was people's behaviors and the city's overall atmosphere that transformed so quickly. The question is, large change happen in such a short time? There are a number of theories to explain this. Some criminologists point to improved policing strategies, like the broken windows theory, which suggests that cracking down on smaller offenses helps prevent bigger crimes. Others credit the decline of MIC or the aging population for the crime drop. But just like with hush puppies, these explanations only partially explain the tipping point, what truly caused the sharp drop. The key seems to lie in a combination of small, incremental changes across various factors together tipped the scale dramatically. Finally, by the late 1990s, the transformation of these neighborhoods was complete. Sidewalks filled with people again, bicycles and children playing outdoors became common sights. Elderly residents, once afraid to sit outside, were back on their stoops. Gunfire, which had been so frequent, became a rare occurrence. This wasn't just a minor improvement, it was a complete turnaround. So just as we saw with hush puppies, this is another example of how small, almost invisible changes can lead to huge reactions. Crime didn't taper off, it plummeted, as if the city had hit a tipping point where the conditions that once fueled crime no longer held sway. So now that we've seen the dramatic decline in New York City's crime rate, let's take a look at the conventional explanations that have been put forward to explain why this happened. First, we have improved policing strategies. This is the explanation often given by the New York City Police, and it focuses on how policing changed during this period. The most famous of these strategies is the broken windows theory, which argues that cracking down on small crimes, like vandalism or fare evasion, can help prevent more serious crimes from occurring. A stronger emphasis on community policing and the use of data to predict crime hotspots, allowing the police to be more proactive in preventing violence before it happened. While these strategies definitely had an impact, they're only part of the bigger picture. The second explanation is the decline of the crack trade in the 1980s and early 1990s. Crack cocaine was at the center of much of the violence in New York. The drug trade fueled gang activity, shootings, and robberies. However, by the mid-1990s, the crack epidemic had begun to fade. Fewer people were using or selling crack, which led to a violence associated with the drug. Criminologists point to this decline as a significant factor in the reduction of crime during this period. Next, we have the aging population. Some experts argue that demographics play a big role in crime rates. As populations get older, crime tends to, because younger people, particularly men in their late teens and early 20s, are more likely to commit crimes. In the 1990s, New York City's population was aging, which some believe contributed to the overall decline in crime. This is a slower, more gradual explanation. It ends up with long-term trends, but it still doesn't fully account for the suddenness of the drop. Finally, there's the idea of economic improvement. Economists suggest that as New York's economy improved in the 1990s, there were more jobs and opportunities available. This economic upswing provides, especially for those who might otherwise have turned to crime. When people are working, they're less likely to engage in criminal behavior, and this effect was certainly at play during this period. All of these explanations, policing, the crack decline, aging, and economic factors, they each contributed to the drop in crime in one way or another. But here's the thing, none of these factors on their own fully explain the sharp, dramatic fall in crime rates. Crime didn't just slowly decline, it plummeted, and it did so in a very short span of time. That's why the idea of the tipping point is so important. These conventional explanations give us part of the answer, but the tipping point theory helps us understand how all these smaller changes interacted to create a much larger and more rapid transformation. Now that we've gone over the conventional explanations for New York's crime reduction, let's take a moment to look at some of the limitations of these explanations. As you can see from this slide, while traditional theories like policing improvements, the decline in the crack trade, and economic growth provide, they don't paint the full picture. Let's break this down into 3 key points. First, we have the issue of long-term trends. While changes in the drug trade, population demographics, and the economy did play a role in crime reduction, these were trends happening across the entire country, not city. So why did crime drop so dramatically in New York compared to other cities? The problem with long-term trends is that they don't account for the magnitude of the change we saw in New York's crime rate. This raises an important question. Why did New York experience decline, while other cities saw much more gradual or modest reductions? Next, let's talk about rapid change. As we've mentioned before, crime in New York didn't taper off slowly, it plummeted. Conventional explanations often struggle to account for the speed at which this happened. Rates dropped in just a few short years. This isn't typical for long-term social or economic trends, which tend to create gradual changes over time. So, while these explanations make sense for longer time frames, they fail to explain how such a dramatic shift could happen in such a... Finally, there's the issue of scale discrepancy. This is one of the most puzzling aspects of New York's crime drop. The changes in policing and other social factors were relatively small. For example, the broken windows strategy and other policing efforts, while impactful, were not on a... So how did these minor adjustments lead to such a large reduction in crime? In neighborhoods like Brownsville and East New York, the murder rate fell by 2/3 in just 5 years. This massive shift seems disproportionate to the relatively small changes that were implemented. How do we explain these 3 limitations, long-term trends, rapid change, and scale discrepancy, suggest that there is more to this story than meets the eye. And this is where the concept of the tipping point becomes crucial. Small, seemingly insignificant changes can accumulate and to a tipping point, where everything changes rapidly and dramatically. As we move forward, we'll explore how these tipping points work and how they can help us understand not just crime reduction, but other areas of social and behavioral changes. Now that we've covered examples and explanations, let's focus on the tipping point concept itself. This is where we tie everything together, whether it's fashion trends, crime rates, or even viral phenomena online. Understanding the mechanics of a tipping point can help explain why seeming shifts can lead to dramatic changes in behavior or societal patterns. There are 3 key elements of the tipping point, which you can see on this slide. Contagiousness. The first element is contagiousness. Just like a virus spreads from one person to another, ideas, products, behaviors, and even spread in the same way. Once an idea or trend reaches the right group of people, it can become contagious, spreading through a community or even across the world. Think of the revival of Hush Puppies. It started with a few kids in the East Village, but once they wore the shoes out in public, noticed and wanted to emulate that style. It's the same concept with crime reduction in New York. A small group of people or certain behaviors shifted, and that change spread across the city like an anti-crime virus. Little causes, big effects. The second component of the tip is that small causes can lead to disproportionately large effects. This might seem counterintuitive, but it's at the heart of the tipping point theory. Sometimes tiny actions or changes can create ripples that turn into massive waves of change. In the case of New York's crime reduction, small tweaks in police, demographic shifts, and economic improvements combined to trigger a sudden drop in crime rates. Similarly, with hush puppies, just a few kids wearing outdated shoes led to a global fashion trend. The key here is to recognize that even seemingly minor changes can have a huge impact together at the right moment. Sudden change. Finally, the third aspect is that change often happens suddenly rather than gradually. The graph and dominoes on this slide illustrate how a tipping point works. Everything looks stable until, all of a sudden, causes a dramatic shift. That's what a tipping point is, a moment when everything changes all at once. This is exactly what we saw with New York's crime rate. It didn't slowly decline, it plummeted. And with hush puppies, the brand went from near extinction to being a fashion staple almost overnight. Contagiousness, small causes with big effects, and sudden change are what define a tipping point. The concept can be applied to almost any area, from marketing to social movements to even health and public policy. As we continue, think about how these principles are areas you're familiar with. What are some examples of tipping points in your own life or in current events? Understanding this framework can give us valuable insights into how small changes can lead to major, transformative shifts in society. Let's return to the Hush Puppies case and break down how this brand revival followed the contagiousness model we discussed earlier. The story of Hush Puppies' comeback is not just about a fashion trend. It's a perfect example of how ideas or behaviors spread like a virus. Here's how it unstepped. Initial adoption. It all started with a small group of kids in downtown Manhattan, particularly in neighborhoods like the East Village and Soho. What's key here is that they weren't wearing hush puppies to make a fashion statement or revive the brand. They were wearing them because the shoes were style. This initial group of adopters simply liked the fact that the shoes were unique and quirky. The brand wasn't deliberately targeting them, but this small group was crucial in planting the seeds for the trend. Exposure and spread. As these early adopters wore the shoes in public, clubs, cafes, or on the streets, they unknowingly became ambassadors for the brand. Others in the city saw them wearing these once outdated shoes, and in doing so, they were infected with the Hush Puppies virus. Just like a contagious disease, the trend began to spread. It's important to note that this spread was entirely organic. No one was trying to market the shoes at this point. It was pure word of mouth. Fashion industry boost. The tipping point really began when major fashion designers like Isaac Mizrahi, John Bartlett, and Anna Sui took note. These designers started using hush puppies in their fashion shows, not as the focal point, but as an accessory to their haute couture collections. This was a critical moment because the fashion industry has the power to legitimize trends. When respected designers include something in their collection, it sends a message to the broader fashion world that this is cool. And so the trend spread even further, this time through the high fashion runway shows and industry insiders. Mainstream adoption. Finally, the trend moved from niche fashion circles to the mainstream. What started as a small localized and quickly spread across the country, hush puppies were no longer just the shoes of a few hipsters. They were now a must-have item in malls all over America. Sales skyrocketed, and the brand experienced a revival that few could have predicted just a year earlier. This stage point was fully realized, with the trend reaching mass adoption and the brand's sales soaring. The key takeaway here is how contagious behaviors can be. A few kids wearing old-fashioned shoes led to a nationwide revival. No marketing campaign could have engineered this type. It was organic, driven by a combination of word-of-mouth exposure and the endorsement of key influencers in the fashion industry. This is the essence of how a tipping point works. A small, almost invisible change can lead to a massive, widespread. Now let's look at how the dramatic drop in New York City's crime rate can be understood through the lens of the tipping point theory. Just as trends can spread like a virus, so too can behaviors, whether they are positive or negative. In this case, we can think of the crime reduction as an anti-crime virus. And here's how it breaks down. The anti-crime virus. The decline in crime wasn't the result of a large percentage of potential criminals suddenly deciding to stop committing crimes. Instead, we can think of it as the spread of an anti-crime virus. Certain lawfulness or abstaining from criminal activities became contagious. This wasn't a top-down process where everyone was told to stop committing crimes. Instead, it was a behavioral shift that started with a small group and spread outward. Small changes, big impact. A small number of people in specific situations, like those involved in drug trade or violence, began behaving differently. This change was often the result of various influences, such as improved policing, social forces, or even shifts in community dynamics. What's fascinating is how this small group's change had a ripple effect. As these individuals began avoiding crime, their actions influenced others around them, and this new behavior spread. This mirrors what we saw with hush puppies. A few early adopters sparked a larger trend, rapid spread. In a surprisingly short period of time, this crime behavior spread across New York. It's almost as if a large part of the population got infected with this virus of non-criminal behavior. The result was a rapid and dramatic decrease in crime rates. Much like how contagious trends spread, this behavioral shift wasn't gradual and across a wide swath of the population. This idea of crime reduction as a contagious phenomenon is a powerful way to understand how large-scale social changes can occur. It wasn't just one factor that caused crime to drop. It was a combination of small changes that reached a tipping point. This concept also reinforces the broader theme of the tipping point theory, where small changes can lead to big, transformative results. Let's now take a closer look at how incremental changes can combine to create massive transformative effects, especially when they reach a tipping point. This slide shows us some of the small but significant changes that occurred in New York City during the 1990s, contributing to a drop in crime rates. While none of these factors alone could have caused the rapid shift, together they formed the foundation for the tipping point. Leveling off of the crack trade. One key change was the decline in the crack cocaine trade. While the crack epidemic had devastated many neighborhoods in the 1980s, early 1990s, the number of people using and selling crack began to level off. This was an important contributing factor to the overall crime reduction, as much of the violence during that time had been linked to the drug trade. Slight aging of the population. Another small but important shift of New York's population. Demographic changes like this can have a big impact on crime rates because younger people, particularly those in their teens and early 20s, are statistically more likely to commit crimes. As the population aged, this potential for criminal activity decreased. Improvements in policing. During this period, New York also saw small but important improvements in policing strategies. Initiatives like the broken windows theory and data-driven policing weren't revolutionary changes in themselves, but they incrementally made law enforcement effective. By focusing on small crimes and being more proactive in preventing crime, the police helped create an environment where crime became less acceptable, further contributing to the drop in crime rates, gradual economic improvement. Finally, the city's economy was slowly improving during this provided more employment opportunities, especially for those who might have been on the fringes of society and at risk of turning to crime. A better economy meant fewer people felt the need to engage in criminal activities to survive. All of these changes, while incremental on their own, contributed to transformation when they reached a tipping point. The butterfly image on the slide is symbolic of the butterfly effect, how small changes can lead to much larger outcomes. Just as the flapping of a butterfly's wings can eventually cause a hurricane in another part of the world, these small shifts created the conditions for a massive decline in crime. What we learn from this is that small, steady improvements, whether in policy, behavior, or the economy, can accumulate and lead to dramatic, system-wide changes when they come together at the right moment. As we wrap up, think about how incremental changes in other areas, such as business, social movements, or even personal growth, can create similar tipping points. What small changes could you make in your environment or behavior that could lead to big effects? We've now covered the incremental changes that contributed to the tipping point. Let's focus on the dramatic moment of change, the tipping point itself, when everything shifts all at once. Rapid transformation. One of the most striking things about both the Hush Puppies revival and the decline in New York City's crime rate, quickly the transformation happened. Neither of these changes built steadily over time. They occurred suddenly with a sense of urgency. One moment, Hush Puppies were an almost forgotten brand, and the next they were a fashion staple. Similarly, crime in New York City didn't gradually decline over just a few years. The crime rate arch. If we look at a chart of New York City's crime rate from the mid-1960s through the 1990s, it resembles a giant arch. Crime rose sharply in the 1960s, reaching a peak in the mid-1970s for nearly 2 decades. Then, in the early 1990s, it suddenly plunged, dropping just as sharply as it had risen. This visual metaphor is important because it highlights the sudden, nonlinear nature of the change. Crime didn't taper off, it plummeted. Sudden brake application. This brings us to the brakes. Crime didn't slowly ebb or gently decrease. It was as if the city hit a brake and crime rates came to a rapid halt. This is what happens in many tipping points. A buildup of factors leads to a sudden stop or shift. Think of it like driving a car. You may be moving steadily, but then forces you to slam on the brakes, causing a dramatic stop. The tipping point defined. All of this culminates in what we call the tipping point. This is that one dramatic moment when everything can change all at once. After all the small incremental changes have built up enough momentum, it's that when a system, whether it's a fashion trend, a crime wave, or any other social phenomenon, suddenly transforms. It's important to note that the tipping point is not the result of one large deliberate action, but rather a combination of small factors that together rapid change. This idea of rapid, sudden transformation is what makes the tipping point concept so powerful. It explains why change doesn't always happen gradually, but instead can occur in a single, dramatic moment. And once that tipping point is almost impossible to stop the wave of change that follows. As we move toward the conclusion, think about other examples where you've seen rapid transformation in your own life or in society. What were the small causes that led to a sudden and dramatic? As we conclude this session, let's bring everything together by discussing the broader concept of social epidemics. The tipping point theory is a powerful way to understand not just isolated events like fashion trends or crime rates, but a wide range of social phenomena. Let's break it down into this epidemic model. The best way to understand how trends emerge, whether it's fashion, crime waves, bestsellers, or even teenage smoking, is to think of them as epidemics. Just like viruses, these behaviors or ideas spread from person to person. It's a behavior or idea, and it quickly spreads through their social network, infecting others. This model of viral spread explains why things can suddenly take off after being relatively obscure for a long time. Just like how a virus needs a certain number of hosts to spread, social behavior point where they suddenly become contagious. 3 key principles. Social epidemics are defined by 3 key principles that we've been discussing throughout this lecture. Contagiousness. Ideas, products, and behaviors spread like viruses. Little causes, big effects. Small, seemingly insignificant actions can have disproportionately large impacts. Sudden change. These transformations don't happen slowly or gradually, but in one dramatic moment. It's this combination that makes social epidemics so fascinating. They are driven by factors almost invisible until they reach a tipping point, at which time they rapidly transform society. The tipping point significance. Understanding the tipping point is crucial for making sense of how modern change happens. From the revival of hush puppies to the sudden drop in New York City, these examples demonstrate how small changes can cause major shifts when they reach a tipping point. This concept is valuable because it provides insight into various social phenomena that might otherwise seem unpredictable. Whether you're looking at marketing, social movements, or even public health, recognizing the factors that lead to a tipping point allows for better strategy and foresight. As you think about the tipping point, remember that the moment of change is rarely the result of one big action. It's a combination of many small things that accumulate and suddenly reach a critical. This framework helps us see patterns in what might otherwise seem chaotic. I encourage you to think about other examples of tipping points that you've seen, whether in your personal experience or on a larger societal scale. What were the small changes that led to a big shift? How did that moment of rapid change unfold? Thank you for your attention today. I hope this exploration of the tipping point has given you new ways to think about social change and how small actions can lead to big effects.